My name is Nora, and I'm 36 years old. I'm married to Caleb, who is 40 years old. We've been married for over 2 years. My spouse is a professor at our local university, and I am an assistant professor there as well. I started at the university 3 years ago since it promised a higher salary and fewer working hours than my former career. My husband works in a top position at the same university and is well liked there. My husband and I met at the university when I was hired as an assistant professor to work under his supervision. He was even present for my interview. I had an instant crush on him since he was intelligent and entertaining. When I got the position working alongside him, I was overjoyed. Our jobs required us to collaborate closely, attending classes and marking papers together. We naturally got to know each other better after spending so much time together. Our friendship began with casual discussions and jokes, but it quickly progressed to having lunch together and spending more time together. Our attraction was mutual, and it wasn't long before we were officially in a relationship. My spouse proposed to me after a year of dating, and I accepted. I enjoyed his company, and his recognized position at the college impressed me. His dominant approach was appealing to me, and he always took good care of me. So I said yes, and we celebrated our union with a short wedding ceremony. Our marriage was going swimmingly. I had moved into his cozy home, and we were living together happily. Our relationship was going well, especially since we also worked together. I was pleased and satisfied with my marriage, believing that I had all I could ever want. My husband embodied the characteristics of a perfect man. He was strong, confident, and charismatic. He had a clear sense of purpose and knew exactly how to attain his objectives. I admired his brilliance and his work ethic. I thought we were a perfect match. However, I ended up losing him because of a minor blunder I made a year into our marriage. I had no idea my error would have such serious implications. I sincerely wish I could undo that error. It all started when a new assistant professor, whom we'll call Christopher, entered our university. Christopher was my age, and he had a charming charisma and self-assurance. I must say he was rather gorgeous. We'd had a couple informal interactions before. However, nothing out of the ordinary occurred. However, while my husband was out of town and I was working from a cafe near the campus, Christopher and I happened to cross paths. We both ordered coffee and began talking. The discussion was lighthearted and fun, ranging from business to our personal lives. Christopher was a single man who had just moved to town. He was easy to converse with, and before I realized it, several hours had passed. We swapped phone numbers and agreed to keep in touch. I didn't think it was significant at the time. I liked communicating with Christopher, but I was content with my marriage to my husband. Little did I know that swapping phone numbers with Christopher would set off a chain of events that would severely derail my life. Christopher and I began contacting each other over the next 2 weeks. Initially, our messages focused on our jobs and interests. They eventually became more flirty. I couldn't believe it at first. I was certain that everyone was aware that I was married and who my spouse was. Christopher began sending amorous texts, and while I might have ignored them, I didn't. Instead, I flirtatiously responded myself. I knew it was wrong, but I couldn't stop myself. I only messaged him while my husband was not present since I didn't want my spouse to find out. I believed I was just having fun with our texts and wasn't doing anything wrong. Then one day, my spouse and I got into a big fight. He wanted to have a child, but I had already told him that I wasn't ready. We had talked about it before, and I had stated unequivocally that I did not want a baby at this time. Raising a child entails tremendous obligations, and I didn't think I was ready for that degree of dedication. I tried to explain it to my husband, but he was too upset to hear me. He said nasty things to me, accusing me of avoiding duties because of my personality. His statements enraged me, and he left the house to get some space. I was home alone, upset and defenseless after our argument. That's when Christopher messaged me and asked if we could meet for a drink. I was hesitant at first, but the temptation was too strong, so I decided to meet with him. Because my husband wanted space away from me, I thought it was only right that I have some space as well. Under the circumstances, I thought it would be fine to meet with Christopher. I decided to meet Christopher that night after I texted him. We chose a bar that was far away from the campus. To avoid running into anyone who could recognize me, I parked on the outskirts of town. The ambience at the pub was wonderful, with dark lights and quiet music creating the ideal environment for a night out. We had a few cocktails and kept the conversation light and fun. However, as the night progressed, things began to spiral out of control. I became really inebriated after ordering so many shots of vodka. Christopher stayed with me all night, and our flirtation got more passionate. It felt like we were the only two people in the world, and I temporarily forgot about my husband's argument. It felt good to get away from the marital turmoil. Even if it was only for a short time, the electricity between Christopher and me was undeniable, unlike anything I had ever experienced. I made a huge mistake that night by cheating on my husband. After that, Christopher took me to my cab as we waited on the sidewalk. He kissed me as we stood there. He offered me plenty of time and room to get away, but I didn't. I returned his kiss. I was so drunk that I didn't realize what was going on until the next morning, when I awoke with a nasty hangover. It took me some time to process what had happened the night before. My kiss with Christopher flashed back to me, and I immediately thought, oh no, what have I done? I emerged from the bedroom to find my spouse in the kitchen, who appeared much calmer than the day before. He asked where I'd been the night before, and I told him I'd gone out with my friends. He nodded and apologized for our quarrel the day before. He reassured me that there was no urgency to have a baby and that he would give me as much time as I needed to make that decision. He was eager to create a family, but he recognized my reservations. I couldn't escape the notion that I had breached my husband's confidence since I was overwhelmed by guilt for my conduct the night before. Even though it was only a kiss, it weighed heavily on my conscience. I greatly regretted my error, but there was nothing I could do about it. I knew I'd made a bad decision, and the guilt was eating me up inside. I wanted to confess to my husband, but I couldn't because of fear. I dreaded his reaction, afraid that he would find out about my indiscretion and decide to leave me. I knew him well enough to know that something like this would not be readily forgiven. When I returned to my bedroom, I discovered text messages from Christopher. He had texted me the night before, asking if I had reached home safely. His texts also emphasized his pleasure at our kiss and his desire to see us again. I blocked him right away, unable to handle the weight of my deception any longer. The shame of not being honest with my husband ate away at me. I adored him, and the notion of hurting his heart with the truth was heartbreaking. But I couldn't get the guts to tell him what had happened between us. Every night, I lay immobile in bed, repeating the moment I committed my awful mistake. The guilt and worry pressed down on my chest like a physical burden. I'd been carrying this guilt since that terrible day, but I couldn't bring myself to confess to my husband. My throat seemed to thicken and silence me every time I tried to pronounce the words. So I made the difficult decision to keep my secret hidden. In the weeks that followed, I tried to appear normal in front of my spouse. Every touch and every kiss from him, on the other hand, made me feel like a fraud, as if I were fooling him and living a lie. I felt myself stuck in a cycle of shame and anxiety, unable to break free. Then, one day, Christopher attended a seminar that my department was hosting. My husband was the event's guest speaker. Seeing Christopher made me nervous because he was aware of our shared secret and might reveal it if he so desired. Fortunately, he chose to remain silent and never recognized my presence on campus. While I was happy that he hadn't betrayed our secret, my guilt grew stronger, like a ticking time bomb waiting to explode at any moment. The day of reckoning has arrived. I was running late for work on a Monday morning. I had a meeting with a coworker, and I was already running 10 minutes late. I hurriedly grabbed my suitcase and left the house, only to find I had forgotten my phone. Panic temporarily overtook me, but I chose to proceed to the university, despite the fact that I would be late for my meeting. I couldn't afford to turn around and risk even more delays. My husband had no plans for the morning and planned to arrive separately for an afternoon meeting. I rushed to my meeting. When I arrived at the campus, a sensation of anxiety gnawing at me. Despite the fact that the meeting was constructive, the feeling that something was wrong lingered. I went back to my office as soon as the meeting ended, my nervousness increasing. I dashed back to my office after the meeting was over. When I opened the door, I was met with a stunning scene. My spouse sat at my desk, clutching my phone and browsing through my texts. I stood still, aware that a reckoning was on the way. My minor blunder has now caught up with me. My spouse averted his gaze to meet mine. His stare was marked with a terrible sense of betrayal. I felt like the biggest idiot on the planet at the time. He stood up and handed me my phone, his voice barely above a whisper as he asked, "Why did you do it?" He had painstakingly analyzed my text messages with Christopher, examining our amorous interactions, references to the kiss, and text content. I was stunned, conscious that there was no excuse for my conduct. All I could do was hang my head in shame, waiting for the repercussions. My husband indicated that he had noticed something strange about my behavior over the last few weeks and assumed it was due to our debate about having a baby. As a result, presuming I was still unhappy, he offered me space. He voiced his surprise, stating, "I never expected you to betray me like this." He walked out of my office without saying anything further, leaving me alone with my crushing remorse and shame. I realized I had irreversibly broken his trust and wondered if I would ever be able to reclaim it. I sat at my desk for what felt like hours in shock and regret. I had destroyed the most important component of my life, my marriage, all because of a careless kiss. Later, I returned home, feeling compelled to explain the issue to my spouse and express my love for him. He sat on the couch in the living room, sipping his whiskey. I approached him and sought to hold him while explaining what had happened. His eyes were filled with frigid detachment and simmering rage as he resisted my touch and shoved me away. I realized I had profoundly hurt him, and there seemed to be no way to make amends. An overwhelming urge to explain the situation overcame me. I admitted that the kiss was the product of excessive intoxication, underscoring that it was only a kiss. He looked at me with rage but stayed silent before finally leaving the house. My spouse scarcely spoke to me in the days that followed. It was almost as if I had vanished. Despite my entreaties for forgiveness, he refused to make eye contact with me or acknowledge me. I felt like a roaming ghost in our house with no purpose. We coexisted in the same house for weeks, yet we hardly exchanged words. Despite my efforts, he continuously denied my advances, refusing to even meet my gaze. Every effort I made was in vain, including attempting to embrace him while he slept, only to be rejected. Initially, I hoped that my constant efforts to seek his forgiveness would heal our relationship. I was certain that we could talk about what had happened and find a way forward. My husband, on the other hand, looked to have made up his mind about the course of action he planned to take. He approached me one day and expressed a desire to speak with me. I listened intently, hoping for a sign of forgiveness and an opportunity to mend our friendship. Unfortunately, my hopes were dashed when he asked me to leave the house. He stated his need for space to clear his mind, underscoring how impossible it would be to do so with me present. This change of events crushed me, and I couldn't believe things had come to this. Despite this, I did not challenge his decision. A small part of me hoped that our time apart might reignite our relationship. I rented a little apartment in town and moved away from our house. Leaving the house was an emotional challenge, and I didn't pack everything, hoping to return and resume life with my husband. Without his presence, adjusting to my solo living in the flat proved to be a lonely and difficult experience. I spent the majority of my days, frequently in tears, reflecting on the unfortunate events that had occurred. I used to bury myself in work to get away from my problems. I had asked to work from home since I was too depressed to face the outside world. My department's chief gave devastating news one fateful day. My job had been terminated instantly. I was completely taken aback. My marriage, home, and now my career all seemed to be falling apart in front of me. I had put my heart and soul into my work, only to have it immediately revoked due to a blunder. Surprisingly, it looked like my husband had a hand in this tragic event. While he had always had controlling tendencies, I had never expected him to go to such lengths. Despite my urgent pleas, the department heads stood firm in their decision. They disclosed that my husband had personally contacted me and demanded my dismissal, threatening to resign if they did not comply. He had used his power and influence within the institution to engineer my dismissal, leaving me without a job or a place to live. I felt so lost and powerless. My heart was still heaving under the weight of my crime's guilt and shame, and now I had to deal with the fallout from my husband's spiteful actions. Days stretched into weeks, and I found myself struggling to make ends meet. My savings were minimal, and after looking for employment all over the place, I had no offers. In every element of my life, I felt like a failure. When Christopher contacted me, however, an unexpected turn of events transpired. Since I had disabled his phone number, he had resorted to emailing me. It wasn't difficult for Christopher to get my mail because he was also a professor at the institution where I used to work. He informed me that he was aware of my predicament and showed a wish to assist me. I hesitated at first since, in many respects, he was the main cause of my dilemma. I was already unemployed, and my spouse had a grudge against me. I couldn't see how things could get any worse, so I agreed to meet with Christopher to see what he had in mind. Our meeting site was a small bistro near my apartment. Christopher was dressed sharply in a suit and smiled charmingly. He offered to buy me a cup of coffee, and we sat at a little table near the window. He listened intently as I told him about my problems. I told him about my husband, my job loss, and my life falling out of control. Speaking with him provided some relief. It was as if a tremendous burden had finally been lifted off my shoulders. It was the first time I'd told anyone about my ordeal. Christopher stayed silent for a moment after I finished detailing my difficulties. Then he leaned closer and clasped my hand in his. He apologized softly, expressing his surprise at the magnitude of my anguish. His gaze locked onto mine, and for a few seconds, I was completely engrossed in his eyes. They radiated a warmth and generosity I hadn't felt in a long time. He almost provided peace. "I want to help you," he said, his gesture soothing. Despite appreciating his gesture, I originally declined, knowing it would infuriate my husband even more. I didn't want to make matters worse. However, as my situation deteriorated with each passing day, I began to consider Christopher's proposal more seriously. With no other options and faith in Christopher's genuine desire to help, I contacted him. He had academic connections and promised to assist me in finding a new job. My attempts to reach out to my husband had been fruitless. He'd been ignoring my calls and refusing to acknowledge my existence. I had constantly called him to discuss my job termination, but his silence was deafening. As a result, I notified Christopher of my change of heart, and he went on to assist me in obtaining a new post at a different university. I had a flicker of hope that my life was finally turning around. Getting a job was the first step towards setting things right. Christopher also helped me with my CV and cover letter, for which I am quite grateful. We hadn't known each other for long, yet he was going above and beyond for me. I believe Christopher was motivated to assist me because of his own guilt over what had happened. We avoided any flirting or inappropriate behavior. His effort to assist me in my job search was real. My thoughts frequently returned to my husband, and I yearned for his forgiveness. I tried to talk to him at the university, but he didn't even notice me and simply told me to go. My need to reclaim his forgiveness grew stronger. After a few weeks, I had settled into my new position. The work was difficult but rewarding, and I was gradually rebuilding my life. Despite numerous attempts, my husband never returned my calls or messages. I remained alone in my modest flat, with Christopher as my only confidant. Just when I was settling into a routine at work, I was unceremoniously let go. I believed my husband was also to blame for this setback. I went to my husband's house and confronted him, inquiring what he was after by constantly denying me work prospects. He became enraged and stated that I should have thought about the implications before cheating on him. My husband learned from his acquaintances that I got my new position working with Christopher's assistance, which led him to suspect I was having an affair with Christopher. He stated his dislike for me and expressed regret that he had ever met me. His rage terrified me. I tried to clarify that nothing was going on between me and Christopher. He was only assisting me in finding work. My husband remained doubtful despite my assurances. In my desperation, I attempted to excuse the events of that fateful night once more, emphasizing how drunk I had been from too many vodka shots. My husband, on the other hand, laughed at my attempts, refusing to accept my reasons. I felt as if I had lost my husband that night. The distance in his voice and the iciness in his tone made it clear that he no longer wanted anything to do with me. As I left his house, tears welled up in my eyes, and I had the sickening feeling that I might never return. I continued to seek work elsewhere, only to be turned down at every turn. I also distanced myself from Christopher, since seeing him brought back the guilt of the night we kissed and acted as a terrible reminder of all that happened after that. When I returned to my flat after another job interview, I discovered an envelope waiting for me. My spouse had mailed me divorce papers. As I stared at the papers, tears welled up in my eyes, understanding that my marriage was ending due to my acts. It hit me hard to realize that a single kiss had shattered my entire existence. I had no idea that one blunder could cost me my marriage and much more. But here I was all alone and with no one to cling to. My circle of acquaintances in town was small, and those I knew were also friends with my husband, so they were unlikely to support me at the expense of their friendship with him. My family had relocated to a different state due to my father's job transfer. The days that followed felt like a horribly long nightmare. I went through a range of feelings, from sadness and rage to remorse and despair. I eventually reached a point where I felt nothing and realized that the only way forward was to slowly rebuild my life on my own. I took a big breath, brushed my tears away, and knew it was time to face reality and move on. I signed the divorce papers despite my reservations. Fighting for my marriage was pointless since my spouse had given up on it and naturally on me. I took responsibility for my actions and respected his decision. I signed the papers and went to my husband's residence to deliver them and pick up my possessions. He let me in by opening the door. After handing him the papers, I indicated that I, too, needed to grab my belongings. He merely nodded and moved aside to let me into the bedroom. I came upon a short note my spouse had written for our first anniversary while looking through my possessions. It said, "I love you more than anything else in the world. You are my life, my sweetheart, and my accomplice. My love, happy anniversary." My eyes welled up as I read the note. What had gone so wrong? How did our love fade? I packed my possessions as best I could and left his house, hoping for a momentary longing gaze from him, but instead met indifference in his eyes. When I got back to my flat, I decided to take a break from everything and go for a walk. I meandered aimlessly, lost in contemplation, and failed to notice an oncoming car rushing toward me. A stranger stepped in and pulled me to safety, barely in time. This experience startled something inside of me. I determined to no longer be a damsel in distress and to reclaim control of my life. I wrote my husband a message expressing that if he was firm in his choice, I wanted the divorce to be finalized as soon as possible. He did not answer immediately, but his lawyers called me and promised me that because the divorce was amicable, the proceedings would be expedited. They laid out the terms, including a fair share of my husband's lifetime earnings. I understand I didn't deserve it, and he wasn't eager to share it with me. He was compelled to do so by law. I instructed them to inform my husband that I did not require any of his money or assets. Despite the fact that I had lost my job and needed the money more than ever, I hoped that this would result in his forgiveness. Regrettably, it did not. Later, the lawyers called me, stating that my husband had claimed that it would have no bearing on his decision. Our divorce proceedings began quickly and went as smoothly as possible. During our court appearances, my husband never looked at me and only interacted with his counsel. His icy demeanor caused me great harm. Within 3 months, the court granted our divorce. I clung to hope till the very end. I waited for my husband to answer no when the judge asked if he was certain about proceeding. That moment, however, never came. My husband seemed relieved to cut all links with me following the divorce, although I missed him every day. I yearned to turn back the clock and rectify my mistake, but it was merely a wish. The weight of my marital downfall was something I had to carry for the rest of my life. After the divorce, a friend reached out for a long overdue catch-up. I agreed reluctantly, lacking enthusiasm. This friend was a mutual acquaintance of both my husband and me. She let slip that my husband had already started dating someone new. As the words escaped her lips, she quickly changed the subject, realizing her slip. I was left in disbelief at the news. I accepted the gravity of my error but still held deep feelings for my husband, with no intention of moving on. However, it appeared he had effortlessly moved forward. I probed for more information, but she remained tight-lipped. I could only blame myself for my current predicament. If I hadn't made that foolish mistake, I would still be at home with my husband. The past couldn't be altered, so my focus shifted to adapting to the present changes. I realized I couldn't keep running into my husband or witnessing him with another woman. To escape the pain, I thought leaving town was the best option. Given that my divorce had become public knowledge, it seemed unlikely that anyone here would offer me a job. I did secure a position in a nearby town, albeit with a significantly lower salary than what I used to earn alongside my husband. With no other choice, I accepted it and relocated. My presence here didn't matter to anyone one way or another. I was simply trying to get through each day. Some days were exceptionally challenging. I contemplated saving some money and seeking therapy to help alleviate the guilt that weighed on me. I would welcome your thoughts on my situation. To those who have asked about my well-being, I appreciate your concern. To be honest, I'm not sure if I'm okay or not. Processing everything that has transpired remains difficult, but I try not to dwell on it excessively. Reflecting on the past few months often leads to emotional breakdowns. I hope that with time, things will improve. As for those wondering if my husband and I attempted to contact each other post-divorce, I did make an effort to reach out. Unfortunately, he blocked my number and other social media platforms. I even sent him a letter, apologizing and expressing my hope for a conversation. However, as expected, his response never came. It's been over a year since my last update, and much has changed during that time. I believed I was finally making progress in life. My breakdowns had become less frequent, and I was actively attending therapy sessions. Thankfully, I hadn't lost my job, which was a small silver lining. Over the past year, I made numerous attempts to reach out to my ex-husband, but each time there was only silence on his end. I even sent birthday wishes through the mail, and our anniversary was particularly challenging for me. Despite my efforts, he remained elusive, still blocking my attempts at communication. I knew he was dating someone else, as a friend had informed me. I held on to the hope that with time, he might have forgiven me and at the very least engaged in a conversation with me. Just talking to him would have meant the world, but that hope gradually faded, and I started taking steps to move forward with my life. Just as I was starting to make progress, a recent event set me back. Last month, I had to visit the town where my ex-husband now resides for some document verification. These documents required his signature, and I tried to contact him through email, but received no response. Eventually, I decided to go there in person, though a small part of me might have been looking for any excuse to see him again. Meeting him after such a long time made me incredibly anxious. When I rang his doorbell, a young woman opened the door. She was not only quite attractive but also visibly pregnant. It was evident that she was carrying his child, and it hurt to see another woman in his home in that condition. The thought of how different things might have been if we had had a child together weighed heavily on me, especially since we had argued about starting a family on the night I went out with Christopher. Guilt overwhelmed me as I stood there, imagining the alternative life we could have had. I struggled to hold back tears, reminding myself not to cry in my ex's house in front of the woman carrying his child. I introduced myself and explained the need for his signature. She recognized me and said he was out, instructing me to leave the documents with her. She assured me that she would take care of sending them to me. It felt like I was being pushed out of the house that had once been mine. With tears in my eyes, I nodded and provided my address before leaving the house. After that day, I began experiencing breakdowns once again. I started having dreams about him, that woman, and their child. I scheduled a therapy session, but even that didn't provide relief. I've come to realize that I cannot escape the weight of this guilt and regret. It will always be with me, a constant reminder of the choices I made.